Thank you for being here today. I just came from a Finance Committee hearing where the majority passed a provision that will take away the rulemaking authority, most of the rulemaking authority of the Campaign Finance Board. The budget bills are proposing to slash the budget of the Campaign Finance Board. There have been refusals of the legislature to confirm members, but we're here today to talk largely about overall what's happening with campaign finance laws in Minnesota. We need to strengthen our campaign finance and public disclosure laws, not weaken them. Our laws we were one of the states that immediately after the Watergate scandal in the 1970s, we passed some tough new campaign finance laws, some of the first in the nation. They've served us well for 40 years. Those laws needed strengthening. There have been advocates, there have been citizens, there have been government reform groups who've been pushing for those changes for 4 decades now. In 1993, I was chairing the Senate Government Ethics and Campaign Finance Reform Committee and actually pushed to move further to say we should take the big money out of politics. Courts have since said we can't do some of that, but our proposal is to ban all PAC money, all lobbyist money, all megabuck contributions, replace it with some public financing, strengthening the laws Minnesota already had. Succeeded in some provisions, but didn't get the guts of the bill. But unfortunately, at the same time, there have been lots of pressures trying to weaken those laws. Politicians who don't want to abide by them, interest groups that want to be able to have more access in the political process, and they've had great success in assaulting the laws and here in other states, largely through the courts. The courts have determined that money is speech, which essentially means the more money you have, the more right you have to influence our democracy. Despite all those attacks, our campaign finance reforms have played a big role in restricting the impact of money in politics. They've stopped many of the worst abuses that we've seen in numerous other states and nationally. Now, all of those efforts would be repealed in the Senate bill. It was 3 lines of a 56-page appropriations bill. This is 40 years of policy, 40 years of reform. They would repeal in 4 lines of a budget bill with very little discussion, very little conversation. I don't think the public's aware of this yet. Powerful interest groups have already succeeded in corrupting our democracy through court rulings such as Citizens United. They've already given big money too much clout at the Capitol. With this repeal, Minnesota will be making an unconditional surrender to big money in politics. Without these limits, all campaign spending limits will be gone. Spending will increase sharply. Candidates who reject special interest money, like myself and a number of others, will have very little chance of winning. Our political system will become even more beholden to the power of interest groups with big money. I think we've got to stop this. I urge the governor to veto this, but before that, I urge the legislature to say, let's not do this. This is not what the public wanted. Thank you.
Well, in every crisis, there's an opportunity, and this is an opportunity for people to understand how it works best. Now they just assume your candidates are running and they get their money from somewhere and it's all bad. But if they can understand that Minnesota has stood among a handful of states who have carefully restricted the spending limits and hence have much cleaner elections, maybe they can say, yeah, that's what I want. I would just want to clarify that it's the spending limits that sets the scene for everything else. And the only way we can do spending limits constitutionally is to have candidates voluntarily agree. And so by having them voluntarily agree, their gift then is a public subsidy and the access to the PCR, the political campaign refund, and those are the things that then draw them. And those things play a part in having individuals contribute their small donations, the PCR, and it plays a part in maybe 1/5 of a candidate's money being from the public subsidy. That's enough to make almost everybody do the agreement, which then abides by the limits. That's how we get the limits. And the limits are the key thing here, because without those limits, you have a race to the top. How much can I spend more than you, and where will I get that from? Until you eventually have a death spiral in that situation, and you have what I call Texas and other states who just don't have these limits. And the example I've been using since I came in 2006 is is a person who also ran for the House of Representatives in Texas, who $750,000 when I spent $21,000. It was doable for me, and in that case, the first time I ran, the public subsidy was 1/4 of that. I was very, very pleased to have limits on how much we could spend. It was a fair playing field. We could manage it between us, and we could actually run this election. We have 201 state legislative elections in the state of Minnesota. Only a handful of them now have been overtaken by outside money, but that's independent. It's the candidate is not to be involved with what their decisions are. The candidate can still stand on their own. But there's still 201 races, and those races are still operating under a decent, sane spending limit. And when we have that, we can actually represent ourselves and what we represent rather than special interests. But I just don't want this to spin out of control and become pay for play kind of a thing. Today and then the other thing that would come out of that is we go spiraling down is cynicism. We would have greater cynicism by our electorate here in Minnesota about, oh, they're all bought. Oh, I can't trust any of them. We're not there yet, but we're getting that message from the national level. Let's not have that here in Minnesota. Let's keep our elections accessible to the what I call the ordinary citizen, the minorities, the women, everybody who doesn't have wealthy amount of wealth themselves, or has a friend who's wealthy, or is willing to be bought by the special interest. Let's keep this accessible. I saw in the Star Tribune today op-ed by somebody, Mark Havman, on good government has an element of cost and quality, and that in order to do both of these things, you have to have not special interests on either side. You can't have the special interest saying, you need to cut government, just cut it, slash it, and you can't have on the other side saying, we got to spend more and more and more without the quality controls. You got to come together, vote your heart, at the same time you're not bought by either side's special interest. Otherwise, we have a downward spiral in how we do government. So if we have sane campaigns, because we have the limits, we then have people here who can make those kind of decisions. And the decisions that we make is the kind of government we get. It's all tied into the same thing. We have to not be obligated to special interests. We have to vote what we know is for the best of Minnesota. Otherwise, we are lost in this whole process, and it's just a death spiral. Thank you. We have some people here from, I will just introduce the three entities, the League of Women Voters, Minnesota Citizens for Clean Elections, and Common Cause. And so we'll have three quick speeches from them.
I'm here representing the League of Women Voters of Minnesota. The League has always strongly stood for empowering voters, and that's against the rise of big and dark money that Senator Laine and Senator Marty are talking about. We're here to give the citizens a question to ask. When you call your legislators, ask them why. Why would we repeal effective programs that have helped Minnesota to be the strong democracy that it is? We want everyone to raise their voices and stop, as Senator Marty said, these damaging proposals before we have to ask the governor to veto them. Stop them in the legislature where the power ought to be. And the League stands firmly behind that.
My name's George Beck. I'm a former chair of the Campaign Finance Board, and now I chair the Minnesota Citizens for Clean Elections. I've been trying to follow the legislative process this session in regard to campaign finances, and it's just shocking, I think, the breadth of the attack on public financing and on effective democracy in the state of Minnesota. The senators and Lonnie have set out the particulars, I think, of what's going on at the present time. They're hidden in a number of bills and sometimes duplicated so that it's difficult to follow and for a person to understand exactly the scope of what's happening. But these are stunning and very harmful changes in the way political campaigns are run in the state of Minnesota. There's strong public support for campaign finance reform and an effective campaign finance board, but neither of those will be in the mix after these bills are adopted. The proposed changes will change the face of Minnesota elections and destroy programs that have been nationally recognized for excellence. Unless we raise our voices, democracy in Minnesota is going to suffer, and pay to play will become the rule. And the way I usually sum it up is just to say, the size of your checking account should not determine the weight of your vote. Thank you.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Anastasia Belladonna Carrera. I'm the Executive Director for Common Cause Minnesota. Thank you so much for being here this morning. While it may be arduous in this very polarizing and charged political climate to completely stop the raging flow of dark money or special interests into the river of our democracy in Minnesota, it is possible to direct it in ways that best protect public integrity and reinforce citizens' confidence in their government. Minnesota's public campaign finance laws do exactly that, and I think that you've heard that both and also championed by both of our senators on that aspect. Common Cause Minnesota and our statewide multi-partisan coalition is going to continue to work in partnership with our legislators, with both sides of the aisle to fortify the integrity of our state's elections. The repeal of the public campaign subsidy program is only one of various other moves compromising our state's ability to appropriately curtail the influence of special interests and dark money intended after the Watergate scandal that Senator Marty spoke so eloquently about. I completely want to send the one message that is that we really need to be involved with our legislators from both sides of this aisle to champion something that is not, in fact, an issue of partisanship, but rather it is and should be a priority of both of our sides of the aisle to work with our constituency and make sure that our democracy in Minnesota continues to be the flagship that's nationally recognized by our democracy experts as being best practices. Thank you so much.
Any questions?
Criticism of this program was that the limits were too low. What are the limits now, and is that part of the problem or part of the concern that's driving this change?
There was concern about the limits being too low. I didn't happen to think they were, but the legislature did significantly increase them about 3-4 years ago. And I think spending limits for House members are around 45 now. 60, okay. The Senate ones are over 80 now, which is plenty. It's close to 90. And again, first-time candidates. That was one of the things I was really proud of about 20 years ago. We allowed first-time candidates, which are people running against the legislators who wrote the law. We gave them a spending bump. It was designed, the laws were carefully designed. They're not perfect by any means, but again, saying that our laws aren't perfect when we're losing against Citizens United and losing against all these other things, this is now saying we're going to get rid of what we have. That really is unconditional surrender to big money.
What do you make of the argument? I know neither of you had a particularly competitive race last time, but those people who have been in competitive races are being swamped by independent spending that they can't keep up with. They're losing control of the message in their own campaigns, and they need to keep up.
This is true, but it's not all our races, 201 races. It's, St. Cloud is probably the key example, and some in the South Metro are huge. We need to work federally to make sure that, and there's actually some legislation that we could do in Minnesota to help tamp that down, disclosure at least. But in Minnesota itself, there are a number of elections that aren't at that point where they're being fed in by outside money, independent expenditures. We need to keep the ones we have clean, because we can see what happens when money flows, when money is the biggest part of a campaign. We can see what happens. Why would we want to open the floodgates for every single race in Minnesota? That's the change that I don't want to see.
And I'd say also, as Carolyn mentioned, the disclosure is a thing we could do now. Disclosure of the dark money. The other thing I think we have to do is we have to get back to the fundamental question. Is this a democracy of ideas, of the public will, or is this a democracy of how much money you have? And the Supreme Court has interpreted, I agree with their interpretation of the importance of the First Amendment, but they've decided, I think it's a false strategic decision, that the more money you have, the more of what they have, the First Amendment. The more variety of opinions, the diversity, the broad pool of ideas for people to consider. In the Buckley-Vallejo decision, they said that's the purpose. That is the purpose of the First Amendment. And I couldn't agree more with them, but their rulings on campaign finance have done the opposite. And I do think we should be pushing for a constitutional amendment to do that. Minnesota Senate passed a thing 3 years ago asking the U.S. Congress to propose a constitutional amendment to change that.
Just as a point of clarity here, you're talking spending limits. There's nothing in these proposals that deals with contribution limits, right?
There are contribution limits in the law now. Some of them, like we have, one of the compromises we had in 1993 was instead of banning all PAC and lobbyists and other big contributions, we allowed candidates to take a certain amount, like 15, 20% from those. And those are all in place, but if we take away the spending limits, those caps go off too. So it will make that worse.
Senator, say a little bit more about what's happening with regard to the confirmation of board members.
The trouble with the Campaign Finance Board is it's the one board that requires, it's the only one that requires diversity of political, they can't be all from the same party. It also is the only one that requires House and Senate confirmation. I think the House has failed to confirm any of the appointments for the last couple of years. The board is struggling, and Mr. Beck could probably speak to that better, but they need a quorum in order to function, and I think they're at the point now where we've tied their hands so much they won't even be able to function. George, did you?
That's the amazing fact, is that there were 2 appointments by the governor that had to be confirmed this session. There's a 45-day limit for the House to act, and they didn't act. So now there are 4 board members, one of whom's term has expired, and they do not have a quorum, and so they can't conduct any business. And it just seems to me that this is a part of the entire plan to de-emphasize and to hinder the board, take away its rulemaking authority, and then not appoint members to the board. So this is a serious problem. The board is the public's only assurance that lobbyists, legislators, and other public officials are going to be regulated in some way. And if that's hampered, it's a serious problem for the people of this state.
Yeah, my understanding is that there's 3 board members right now, and that's not a quorum. I received a note from somebody saying that he's been going to the Campaign Finance Board meetings on a regular basis, and he says how scrupulously careful they are to not have one party have advantage over another, that they have great respect among the board members and great respect for the situation of legislators and their needs, and they're just a force for fair and honest elections. They protect candidates from each party from dishonest actions by the other party or outsiders, and they just protect the integrity of primary elections also. We all benefit from a healthy functioning. I thought this was very good words of how he put it out here, that this board is very important, and I see 5 attacks on it. The repealing of the limits, which takes down the entire program, and the PCR, the deep cuts into they're only 9.5 FTEs, very small. And that's only up a couple from a few years ago when we said, you're not investigating when somebody says they have a donation from here and that other entity doesn't report it. You're not making these things, you're not finding out what the reason is. And so they upped it, they gave them enough money to up it, enough people to do these investigations, and now they're lowering it down. 9.5 people to begin with, and then not allowing rulemaking, which is just a key word in some of the legislators that just, if you say rulemaking, I'm on your tail, I'm going to make you not have it. It's just a code word for kill, and they're taking away the rulemaking of the Finance Board, which means that when a law is passed and there's something that for people to follow, people call in and say, well, what does this mean? Does it mean this? How about this? How about this? So then they have to come up with rules around what they mean by that. It's a normal process of government. And they say, we don't like rulemaking, so we're going to ban you from being able to do it. So how are they going to give the advice to all the people that call in and ask for an interpretation? And then not confirming the board members so they can carry on. This is just a across-the-board attack on our clean elections.
On the non-confirmation part, do Do you think it's an oversight or a deliberate effort to stymie this board from doing what it is?
I don't know. We don't try and speculate on motivation in the legislature, but the impact is the same either way. The board is not able to function. We're going to take away their rulemaking authority if they are able to function. We're taking away their budget. The sad thing about this, what scares me, is 40 years of work just totally repealed in a budget bill. It's totally repealing everything we've done. And these things are hard to get. You usually get these reforms after a scandal, after Watergate. In 1993, the reason we had some reforms happen was the PhoneGate scandal and plus investigative report. Bill Salisbury, I think, was one of the people involved in it, doing an excellent investigative report on the impact of big money. Those are the times where we made steps forward. Now when there's no single scandal out there to point to, oh, let's just secretly get rid of all this stuff. We're surrendering to it, and now there are so many illustrations of where big money is having an impact. I just think at a certain point the public everybody gives up and we just throw out all the laws and let's just have the Wild West.
How would you respond to criticisms of the program that Democrats benefit more because they get about 60%, 61%, I think, of the money every year?
The PCR program, I think the Republican Party has gotten more on, Democratic Party, that's based on checkoffs. My proposal was every candidate ought to get the same amount, despite where they are in the state, what party they are. I agree it should be the same for everybody.
And I just want to say that the public subsidy is based on your taxpayers in your district who check off the box on the Minnesota tax form. Yes, I want $5 to go to this fund. It's not their money, it's the state money, but they're saying, I want to direct my tax money to this. It's important to me. And the thing is, it depends on the taxpayers being aware of that, because otherwise they just see it and ignore it or don't even see it at all. But if they're aware of it, they can make that checkbox. So I had the experience when I first ran that my side of the district was more Democratic index, and the other side of the district was leaned more red. But my friend who ran on Kate Knuth actually, who ran on the other side, actually got more public subsidy dollars because more people had checked off that box. They wanted to go into fair and clean elections and support this idea of a public subsidy, and she got more money even though she had less Democratic base. So it isn't necessarily based on that. It's based on who sees and knows the importance of this, to check off that box, to have this fund there, and so that there'll be that voluntary agreement to stay under the limits. It's just based on that. It's just on awareness.
And a related thing over the years has been the campaign contribution refund program. What's the status of that at this point? And what happens in these bills?
That's another one of the attacks on it. That has been suspended for a couple years, and this year I believe the House tax bill would repeal it permanently. That's the other part of the public financing. The question in my mind is, first of all, I do think all candidates should have the same amounts, that they should have the same limits. But the other question is, in a democracy, who should own the politicians? The interest groups or the public? I think the public ought to own the politicians. If somebody's going to own them, it ought to be the public, not the interest groups. And that's what the public financing should be for.
And the PCR is well known at some level too, that it favors the Republicans have gotten more from the refund program than the Democrats have. But again, it's just people being able to contribute, people being able to be aware of it. It isn't politically designed either way.
If you could be so kind, we transmit this back electronically sometimes, and even if you give me a piece of paper with who spoke and how to say and spell your name, could you, everyone who spoke, just say it, put your name, so whoever watches this will know.
Just say your name and spell it.
Lonnie Skrentner, LONNI-SKRENTNER. I'm president of the League of Women Voters of Edina and a member of the State Democracy Task Force.
Thank you, Lonnie.
George Beck, BECK, Minnesota Citizens for Clean Elections.
Mine is Anastasia Belladonna Carrera, and that I will definitely spell out very carefully. Anastasia, ANNASTACIA, Belladonna, BELLADONNA hyphen Carrera, CARRERA, and I'm Executive Director with Common Cause Minnesota.
Thank you.
Thank you all.
And I just wanted to point out that George Beck is also 30 years in the administrative law judge, so Judge Beck. Yes. Thank you.
Thank you.